CEO drenched a stranger in wine at elite party, then learned he decides their £500 future. The wine hit his face before he could speak. Red, expensive, deliberate. It streamed down his jaw, soaked into the collar of his $8,000 suit, and dripped onto the marble floor of the Whitmore Capital Leadership Gala while 300 guests watched in silence. Now you know where you fit. Quincy Beneth lowered the empty glass, her crimson gown catching the chandelier light like a warning. The man she'd just humiliated, the man whose name she hadn't bothered to learn, wiped his face slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. "Are you finished?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. It should have been a surrender. Instead, it sounded like the beginning of something. In 45 minutes, Quincy Beneth would learn that the stranger she'd just drenched in Merlot controlled her company's entire future. In 48 hours, she would lose everything. But right now, she was still laughing. Hi there! Before I proceed to the best part of this story, please do me a little favor. Hit that subscribe button and share this video. Don't forget to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's continue. You think you can just walk in here and help yourself? Quincy Beneth's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade through silk. She snatched the wine glass from the black man's hand, the man in the charcoal suit who had been standing quietly at the edge of her circle, observing, saying nothing. This is the Whitmore Capital Leadership Gala. She held the glass up like evidence. Do you have any idea what it costs to breathe the same air as the people in this room? The man turned toward her, calm, unhurried. His voice was low, measured. I'm a guest. Quincy laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made the diamonds at her throat glitter. A guest? She stepped closer, her crimson satin gown catching the light from the chandeliers above. Then tell me, who invited you? Name one person in this room who would vouch for someone like you. Silence. 300 guests watched. Phones lifted. No one moved. The man, Jackson, though she didn't know his name yet, simply looked at her. Not with anger, not with fear. Just patience. The kind that comes from knowing something she didn't. It infuriated her. That's what I thought. Quincy grabbed her own glass from the champagne table behind her. Merlot. Deep red. Worth more than most people's car payments. Let me teach you something about where you fit. She lifted the glass and poured. The wine hit his face first, then his neck. Then it streamed down the lapel of his suit, a suit that fit too well, she noticed, even as she ruined it, soaking into the fabric, dripping onto the marble floor in thick crimson drops. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Quincy didn't flinch. Maybe next time, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, you'll learn the difference between belonging and trespassing. Jackson stood completely still. Wine dripped from his jaw. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, removed a handkerchief, and wiped his face with the kind of deliberate calm that made Quincy's stomach tighten for reasons she couldn't name. Are you finished? He asked. Her jaw clenched. Security. 2 guards materialized from the crowd. Escort him out, Quincy ordered, turning back to her guests with a forced smile. He's trespassing. Jackson nodded once, just once. As the guards led him toward the exit, he didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't resist. Quincy raised her fresh champagne glass to her circle. Honestly, she laughed, shaking her head. The audacity of some people. A few guests chuckled, nervously. But something had shifted. The air felt different. Colder, and somewhere, between the elevator doors closing and the quiet ding of his departure, the videos had already begun to spread. Have you ever watched someone so certain of their power that they couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath their feet? 45 minutes earlier, everything had been different. The black Escalade pulled to the curb outside the Whitmore Grand at 7:15 p.m. Duru Jackson stepped out alone. No driver holding the door, no assistant trailing behind, no security scanning the entrance. Just him, and the October wind that tugged at the collar of his charcoal Tom Ford suit. The building rose 40 floors above Michigan Avenue, every window blazing gold against the darkening sky. A red carpet stretched from the sidewalk to the entrance, where women in gowns worth more than houses posed for photographers they pretended not to notice. Jackson straightened his cuffs and walked. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. From Whitmore Capital, Board Relations. Subject, Infrastructure Fund. Final authorization. Mr. Jackson, as discussed, you retain sole discretionary authority over the £500 allocation. Beneth Global Solutions presentation scheduled for 9 p.m. Your decision will be final. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. 5 years of due diligence, 18 months of quiet evaluation, background checks on every executive at Beneth Global, including the CEO herself, financial audits stacked 3 inches high in his home office. Everything pointed to tonight. Everything pointed to yes. But Jackson had learned something long ago. Something his grandfather had taught him in a woodshop in Detroit before venture capital and infrastructure funds and rooms full of chandeliers. Numbers tell you what a company is worth. Character tells you what it's worth to you. He'd come tonight to observe, to listen, to see how Beneth Global's leadership behaved when they didn't know they were being evaluated. The invitation in his pocket was real. His name was on the donor wall, but he'd asked, specifically, that his attendance remain unannounced. "Good evening, sir." The woman at the registration desk smiled warmly. Her name tag read, Catherine Mills, Event Coordinator. "May I have your name?" "Jackson. Duru Jackson." Her fingers moved across the tablet. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, then smoothed into professional composure. "Of course, Mr. Jackson. Welcome. The main ballroom is on the 40th floor. Cocktail hour is underway." "Thank you." He took the elevator alone. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers as the car rose smoothly, silently. His reflection stared back from the polished brass doors. 44 years old, son of Nigerian immigrants. First in his family to graduate college, then law school, then an MBA from Wharton that his mother still kept framed in her living room in Southfield. He'd built the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund from a $2 million seed investment 15 years ago. Now it controlled $1.3 billion in assets across real estate, technology, and urban development. But you wouldn't know it to look at him. That was the point. The elevator dinged. Doors opened. The ballroom sprawled before him. A sea of silk, crystal, and cultivated laughter. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from a ceiling, painted with Renaissance-style angels. Servers in white gloves wove through the crowd with champagne and canapes. Jackson recognized faces from Forbes covers, senators, hedge fund managers, old money and new wealth circling each other like planets in a gilded orbit. Near the champagne table, a woman's laugh rose above the crowd. Loud, confident, commanding, Quincy Beneth. He'd seen her photo in the reports. 46. CEO of Beneth Global Solutions for the past 8 years. Daughter of the founder. Inheritor of a legacy she'd spent 2 decades defending and, according to some accounts, weaponizing. She wore a crimson satin gown that caught the light like fire. Blonde hair swept back, diamonds at her throat, her wrists, her ears. 5 people surrounded her, all leaning in, all laughing at something she'd said. "And I told them," Quincy's voice carried across the room, "if you can't compete at this level, you shouldn't be at this table." The group erupted. Jackson saw a few other guests shift uncomfortably. No one spoke up. He moved toward the edge of the room, taking a glass of wine from a passing server. Watching, listening. A man appeared beside him. Tall, silver-haired, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Jackson," the man kept his voice low. "I'm Charles Whitmore. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I like to see things for myself." Charles glanced toward Quincy's circle. His expression tightened. "She's been performing tonight. Earlier, she made a comment about diversity hires diluting executive quality." 3 people left. Everyone else pretended not to hear. Jackson nodded slowly. He'd read the internal reports. 14 complaints filed against Quincy Beneth over the past 5 years. 12 had been resolved before reaching the board. 2 former employees had signed NDAs. The company needed his money, $500 million to expand their infrastructure division, to save them from a bankruptcy filing within 18 months. That gave him leverage. But leverage meant nothing if the foundation was rotten. "Give it an hour," Jackson said quietly. "I'll observe, then we'll talk." Charles nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Jackson stayed where he was, sipping his wine, watching. 10 minutes passed. Quincy held court. Her circle grew. Her laughter grew louder. Then her gaze swept the room and landed on him. She frowned, said something to the woman beside her. Then she was walking toward him, heels clicking against the marble, smile sharpening into something that wasn't quite a smile at all. "Excuse me." Her hand reached past him and grabbed his wineglass before he could respond. Jackson turned. Quincy Beneth stood there, head tilted, eyes flicking over him like she was cataloguing everything wrong with his presence. "This champagne is for guests." "I am a guest." She laughed, short, dismissive. "No, you're not." Jackson remained still. "I was invited." "By who?" The question landed like a slap. He could end this in 3 words. Could pull out his phone. Could summon Charles Whitmore. Could tell her exactly who he was and watch the color drain from her face. But something held him back. Curiosity, maybe, or perhaps something older, deeper. A memory of every room he'd ever entered where someone had looked at him, really looked, and decided, before he'd spoken a single word, that he didn't belong. He wanted to see how far she would go. "That's what I thought." Quincy turned to her friends, who had gathered closer, drawn by the scent of spectacle. "See? They never have an answer." A man in a tuxedo, her CFO, Jackson recognized from the reports, stepped forward. "Look, friend, this event is invitation only, very exclusive. If you leave quietly, we'll forget this happened." "I appreciate the concern," Jackson said, "but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Quincy's eyes narrowed. "Your suit." She circled him slowly. "Is that supposed to be Tom Ford? The stitching is tragic." The suit had cost $8,000, custom fitted in Milan. "And that watch," her CFO pointed. "Patek Philippe, please. The face is all wrong." The watch was real, worth more than most people's annual salary. Jackson said nothing. "Show me your invitation," Quincy demanded. "Right now. Prove you belong here." Jackson reached into his jacket. His fingers touched the envelope. But before he could pull it out, Quincy grabbed it. She tore it open, scanned the text. Her eyes narrowed. This is fake. Obviously fake. Anyone can print something on cream paper. Let me see that. Her CFO took the invitation, studied it. The font looks right, but nothing, Quincy cut him off. Look at him, Bradley. Does he look like he belongs at a $50,000 per seat event? What exactly am I supposed to look like? Jackson asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Quincy's mouth opened, closed. She knew the trap, could feel the edges of it, but she couldn't stop herself. Professional, she finally said. Established. Someone with actual credentials. Not, she gestured vaguely at him, this. Jackson held her gaze. You don't know who I am. I know exactly who you are. Quincy stepped closer. You're the kind of person who thinks showing up is the same as earning a place, who thinks silence is the same as confidence. Her lip curled. You're nobody. And in 30 seconds, security is going to escort you out, and everyone in this room is going to forget you ever existed. Jackson considered this. Then he smiled, just barely. I'll remember this conversation. It should have sounded like a threat, but it didn't. It sounded like a promise. And that, more than anything, made Quincy's hand tighten around her glass. What she didn't know, what no one in that room understood yet, was that the man standing before her, wine dripping from his face, controlled the single largest infrastructure fund in the Midwest, that the $500 million her company desperately needed to survive. He was the only person on Earth who could approve it. And he had just made his decision. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft whoosh, sealing out the ballroom's golden light and muffled laughter. Jackson stood alone in the descending car, wine still drying on his collar, and allowed himself one slow breath. He'd been here before. Not this elevator, not this building, but here. In this moment, this feeling, this quiet aftermath of being measured by everything except who he actually was. The first time, he'd been 23, fresh out of law school, interviewing at a firm in Manhattan. The partner had looked at his resume, looked at his face, and asked if he'd gotten in through one of those diversity programs. Jackson had answered the question, got the job, quit 18 months later to start his own fund. The second time, he'd been 31, walking into a bank in Chicago to finalize a $40 million acquisition. Security had stopped him in the lobby, asked if he was with the cleaning crew. He'd smiled, shown his ID, and closed the deal an hour later. The third time, the fourth, the 10th. After a while, you stopped counting. You learned something instead, that anger was expensive and silence was an investment, that the people who needed you to prove yourself were never the people whose opinions mattered. That power didn't require recognition, it required patience. His grandfather had taught him that too. Duru, the old man used to say, standing in his woodshop with sawdust on his hands and wisdom in his eyes. A tree doesn't announce how deep its roots go. It just stands when the storm comes. Jackson had built his entire career on that principle. The Whitmore Infrastructure Fund didn't advertise, didn't seek press coverage, didn't put his face on Forbes covers or his name on buildings. He attended galas like this one quietly, arriving alone, leaving early, watching how people behaved when they didn't know they were being evaluated. Because contracts could be negotiated, financials could be audited. But character? Character only revealed itself when no one important was watching. The elevator reached the lobby. Doors opened. Jackson stepped out into the marble atrium, his footsteps echoing against stone walls. A few guests lingered near the entrance, champagne in hand, unaware of what had just happened 40 floors above. He found a quiet alcove near the coat check and pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls. 12 text messages. His inbox was already filling with alerts. He ignored all of it. Instead, he opened the email he'd received earlier that evening, the one he'd glanced at in the car. The one that had been sitting in his pocket the entire time Quincy Beneth was pouring wine down his face. From Whitmore Capital, Board of Directors. To Duru Jackson. Subject: Infrastructure Fund. Final authorization. Mr. Jackson, as discussed in our October 3rd meeting, you retain sole and final discretionary authority over the $500 million infrastructure allocation currently under review. The Beneth Global Solutions proposal has met preliminary financial thresholds. However, per your standing instructions, no commitment will be made without your explicit written approval. Your decision is final. No board override applies. We await your guidance. Regards, the Whitmore Capital Board of Directors. Jackson read the email twice. Then he locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Upstairs. Quincy Beneth was probably laughing about him right now, probably telling her circle how she'd handled the intruder, how she'd protected the sanctity of her precious gala, how people like him needed to learn their place. She had no idea. No idea that the man she'd just humiliated had spent 5 years studying her company, that he'd reviewed every complaint filed against her, every NDA signed, every employee who'd left without explanation. That he'd delayed this investment 3 times because something in the reports didn't sit right, something he couldn't quantify but could feel. Tonight was supposed to answer his questions. It had. Just not the way he'd expected. Jackson walked toward the exit, past the photographers, past the valets, past the red carpet that glowed under artificial light. The October wind hit his face as he stepped outside. Cool, clean, clarifying. He could have told her who he was. Could have pulled out his phone, summoned Charles Whitmore, watched her expression crumble in real time. But what would that have proven? That he had power? That she should have been nicer to him because he controlled her future? No. Respect shouldn't depend on resumes, and consequences shouldn't require an audience. He raised his hand. A black Escalade pulled to the curb. Jackson climbed inside, closed the door, and sat in silence as the city lights blurred past the window. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from Charles Whitmore. Jackson, I just heard what happened. I'm so sorry. What do you want to do? Jackson typed his reply slowly, deliberately, the same way he did everything. Nothing tonight. I'll be in touch Monday. Then he turned off his phone, leaned back against the leather seat, and let the silence do what it always did. Wait. Quincy Beneth had learned early that the world was a stage, and the only crime was showing weakness. She stood at the center of her circle again, champagne flute raised, smile perfectly calibrated. Not too wide, not too tight. The incident with the intruder was already fading into anecdote, another story she'd tell at brunch next week about the audacity of some people. Honestly, she laughed, shaking her head, you'd think security would do their one job. Her circle laughed with her. They always did. But beneath the silk and diamonds, beneath the confidence she wore like armor, something hummed. A low, persistent frequency she'd learned to ignore years ago. Fear. Not that she'd ever name it that. Quincy called it vigilance, called it discipline, called it the price of holding together a company that had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years while the board pretended everything was fine, and her father's ghost watched from every portrait in the executive suite. Beneth Global Solutions, her inheritance, her burden. her proof that she belonged at tables her mother had only dreamed of. The $500 million infrastructure deal was supposed to change everything. Whitmore Capital had been circling for months, due diligence, financial reviews, endless meetings with lawyers who charged more per hour than her first apartment had cost per month. If the deal closed, Beneth Global would survive, expand, thrive. If it didn't... She took another sip of champagne and pushed the thought away. Control the narrative. Control the room. Control yourself. Her father's words. The only useful thing he'd ever given her, besides the company and the pressure and the impossible expectation that she'd be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Quincy. Her assistant, Meredith, appeared at her elbow, young, eager, perpetually anxious. The PR team is asking about the incident. Someone's already posted video. Delete it. It's on multiple accounts, at least a dozen. Quincy's smile didn't waver. Then call legal. Issue takedown notices. This is a private event. We have grounds. Meredith hesitated. Some of the comments are not great. Comments are noise. Quincy turned back to her circle. Handle it. She watched Meredith scurry away and felt a flicker of irritation. This was the problem with young people. They panicked over everything. A video? Please. She'd survived hostile takeover attempts, shareholder revolts, a divorce that had made page 6. A 60-second clip of her removing an intruder from a private gala was hardly a crisis. Besides, she'd been right. The man didn't belong there, didn't have credentials, didn't have the bearing of someone who'd earned a place in that room. And if she'd been firm, well, that was leadership. Someone had to maintain standards. Power equals control. Appearances equal legitimacy. The lessons she'd learned climbing from her father's shadow into her own light. The rules that had kept her alive in rooms full of men who'd underestimated her, dismissed her, tried to push her aside. She'd earned this. Every chandelier, every diamond, every laugh that rose at her command. 20 minutes later, the first crack appeared. Quincy was mid-sentence, something about quarterly projections, delivered with the easy authority of someone who'd memorized the numbers, when Bradley approached with his phone in hand. Her husband, her CFO, her most reliable ally, even when she wanted to strangle him. Quincy. His voice was low, careful. We need to talk. Now? Now? She excused herself with a practiced smile and followed him to a quiet corner near the service entrance. What is it? Bradley held up his phone. The video was playing. Her voice, sharp and clear, the whine arcing through the air, the man's face as it hit him. It's trending, Bradley said, not just locally, nationally. Quincy's jaw tightened. So, we'll manage it. There's more. He scrolled to a comment thread. People are asking who he is. Someone's claiming they recognized him. Recognized him as what? A caterer? Bradley didn't laugh. Quincy. He hesitated. Charles Whitmore just texted me. He's asking questions. The name landed like ice water. Whitmore. The fund. The deal. What kind of questions? About the incident. About the man you... He paused. Removed. Why would Charles Whitmore care about some random... Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A text from her board liaison sent 30 seconds ago. Quincy, call me immediately. There's a situation. The man from tonight. His name is Duru Jackson. The name meant nothing to her, but the tone did. Who is Duru Jackson? She asked, her voice steady, even as something cold began to spread through her chest. Bradley's face told her everything. I don't know yet, he said quietly. But I think we're about to find out. The video crossed 100,000 views, before Quincy reached the private lounge upstairs. By the time she sat down, it had doubled. Her phone buzzed constantly now, a relentless vibration against her palm that felt less like notifications and more like a countdown. "Pull it up," she ordered. Meredith fumbled with the tablet, her fingers trembling as she navigated to the trending section. The screen filled with Quincy's face, frozen mid-paw, wine suspended in air, the stranger's expression calm and unreadable beneath the cascade of red. The caption read, "CEO humiliates black man at elite gala, claims he doesn't belong." 200,000 views now. Comments poured in like floodwater. "Who is she? Someone find out." The way he just stood there. That man has more dignity in his silence than she has in her entire company. This is disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. Her name is Quincy Beneth, CEO of Beneth Global Solutions. Let's make sure she trends for the right reasons. Quincy's stomach lurched. "Get legal on the phone," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "Now." The next 45 minutes blurred into a fever dream of phone calls, threats, and damage control that refused to stick. Her legal team issued takedown notices. The platforms ignored them. Public interest, they claimed, newsworthy content. Her PR director drafted a statement. The incident involved a security concern at a private event. Ms. Beneth acted to protect guests from an unverified individual. It backfired immediately. Unverified individual? He was standing there holding a wine glass, not a weapon. This is what happens when rich people think rules don't apply to them. Security concern equals black man existing in her space. 300,000 views. Bloomberg picked it up, then CNN, then everyone. The board called an emergency session at 11 p.m. Quincy sat at the head of the conference table in the Whitmore Grand's executive suite, surrounded by 6 men who had spent the last decade nodding at her ideas and cashing checks she'd earned for them. Now they looked at her like she was a liability. "The optics are catastrophic," said Harrison Wells, the longest-serving board member. 72 years old, silver-haired, and suddenly very interested in distancing himself. "We're getting calls from partners, investors. The media wants a statement." "We issued a statement. It made things worse." Quincy's jaw tightened. "Then we issue another one. We explain the context." "There is no context that makes this acceptable." Harrison leaned forward. "Quincy, do you have any idea who that man was?" The question hung in the air. "His name is Duru Jackson," Harrison continued. "He controls the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund." The words landed like a physical blow. "No." Quincy shook her head. "That's not possible. I've been in meetings about this deal for 18 months. I've never seen his name on a single document." "Because he doesn't attend publicly, doesn't advertise. But every major capital decision, every single one, requires his explicit written approval." The room seemed to tilt. "The $500 million expansion," Bradley said quietly from beside her. "It lives or dies with him." Quincy's mouth went dry. The man she'd poured wine on. The man she'd called a trespasser. The man she'd humiliated in front of 300 guests and 1,000 recording phones. He controlled everything. "We need to reach him," she heard herself say. "Immediately. I need to explain—" "Explain what?" Harrison's voice was cold. "That you made assumptions based on how he looked. That you decided he didn't belong before asking a single question." "I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem." Silence swallowed the room. Quincy felt something she hadn't experienced in years, something she'd spent her entire career building walls against. Fear. Real fear. The kind that crawled up your spine and whispered that everything you'd built was made of glass. "Get me his number," she said quietly. 12 minutes later, Quincy stood alone in the hallway outside the executive suite. Phone pressed to her ear. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. She rehearsed the words in her head. I didn't know. I made a mistake. Please let me explain. 4 rings. 5. Then, you've reached Duru Jackson. Leave a message. A beep. Silence. Quincy opened her mouth to speak and found nothing. What could she possibly say that would undo what she'd done? She ended the call without leaving a message, stood there in the empty hallway, phone clutched in her hand, the weight of $500 million pressing down on her chest. Somewhere across the city, Jackson's phone lit up with a missed call. He looked at the screen. Quincy Beneth. Then he set the phone face down on the table and returned to his silence. The call came at 7:43 a.m. Quincy hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep. She'd spent the night watching numbers climb, view counts, comment threads, news articles multiplying like cells under a microscope. Her face was everywhere now, frozen in that moment of absolute certainty that had already begun to unravel everything. When her phone rang with an unknown number, she answered before the second ring. Hello? Ms. Beneth. The voice was calm, unhurried, familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. This is Duru Jackson. She stood up from her desk so quickly she knocked over her coffee. Brown liquid spread across documents she no longer cared about. Mr. Jackson? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Thank you for calling. I've been trying to reach you. I know. Silence. Quincy gripped the phone tighter. I want to apologize. What happened last night? It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were. If you had known, Jackson interrupted gently, would you have acted differently? The question stopped her cold. Yes. Of course. Why? Another pause, longer this time. Because... She searched for words that wouldn't condemn her, found none. Because I would have understood your position, your authority. So the apology is for misjudging my status, not for how you treated a human being? Quincy's throat tightened. That's not what I... Ms. Beneth. His voice remained soft, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. I've spent 30 years walking into rooms where people looked at me and decided before I spoke a single word that I didn't belong. Last night wasn't unique. It was just recorded. She closed her eyes. I stood there, Jackson continued, and I waited. Gave you every opportunity to ask a question. To pause. To consider that you might be wrong. Instead, you poured wine on a stranger because he didn't look like he deserved to breathe your air. I was protecting my event. You were protecting your assumptions. The words landed like a verdict. Quincy sank into her chair. The fight drained out of her, replaced by something colder, heavier. What do you want me to say? Nothing. Jackson's tone didn't waver. There's nothing to say. I called because I believe in directness, and you deserve to hear this from me rather than through lawyers. Her heart stopped. Hear what? I'm withdrawing from the investment, effective immediately. The room tilted. No. The word came out before she could stop it. No, please. This company employs 3,000 people. Families depend on us. One mistake. Was it a mistake? Jackson asked quietly. Or was it a decision you felt entitled to make? She couldn't answer. Respect shouldn't depend on resumes, Ms. Beneth. Character shouldn't require an audience. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought no one important was watching. Tears burned at the edges of her vision. She blinked them back. I can change. I can make this right. Perhaps you can. His voice softened just slightly. But not with my money, and not on my time. A pause. Goodbye, Ms. Beneth. The line went dead. The dominoes fell faster than anyone predicted. By noon, Whitmore Capital issued a formal statement. After careful consideration, the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund has elected not to proceed with the proposed investment in Beneth Global Solutions. We wish the company well in their future endeavors. No explanation, no accusations. Just a door closing with devastating finality. By 2 p.m., the board convened an emergency session, without Quincy present. By 4 p.m., they announced her suspension pending investigation. Leadership concerns was the official language. Everyone knew what it meant. By market close, Beneth Global's stock had dropped 18%. Partners began calling to reassess contracts. Employees whispered in hallways, wondering if their jobs would survive the week. The video crossed 3 million views. Comments had evolved from outrage to analysis. Think pieces about corporate culture, Twitter threads dissecting every frame, LinkedIn posts from executives desperate to distance themselves from that kind of leadership. Quincy sat alone in her office, watching it all unfold on screens that had once displayed quarterly profits and expansion plans. This isn't revenge, she realized. Jackson hadn't attacked her, hadn't leaked information, hadn't given interviews or demanded public apologies. He'd simply stepped back and let consequences do what consequences do. At 6 p.m., the headline appeared on Bloomberg's front page. £500 deal collapses after viral gala incident. Beneth Global faces uncertain future. Quincy stared at the words until they blurred. Somewhere across the city, Jackson turned off the news and sat in silence. There was nothing left to say. The first lawsuit arrived 11 days after the video went viral. A former Beneth Global employee named Denise Carter, terminated 3 years prior for performance issues, filed a complaint alleging racial discrimination, hostile work environment, and wrongful termination. Her story was specific, documented, devastating. Ms. Beneth told me during a performance review that I didn't fit the company culture. When I asked what that meant, she said some people just aren't built for this environment. I was the only black woman on my team. The complaint had been filed internally in 2022. It had disappeared before reaching HR. Now it was national news. Within 2 weeks, 6 more former employees came forward. Then 12, then 19. Stories emerged like bones surfacing from shallow graves, years of complaints buried under NDAs and severance agreements, whispered warnings passed between employees, a pattern so consistent it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The State Attorney General opened an investigation. The SEC requested financial documents. Former board members suddenly remembered concerns they'd raised privately, but never pursued. Everyone had seen something. No one had done anything. Until now. Quincy watched her empire crumble from behind the windows of her penthouse apartment. She'd been advised not to leave, not to speak publicly, not to engage with the press that camped outside her building, waiting for a shot of her looking broken. She wouldn't give them that. But alone, in the grey light of early morning, the truth pressed against her chest like a stone. She'd built everything on control, on appearances, on the unwavering belief that she was smarter, harder, more deserving than anyone who questioned her. Now, the questions were everywhere. Did you know about the complaints? Did you authorize the NDAs? Did you believe you were untouchable? Her lawyers advised a settlement strategy. Her publicist drafted apology statements she refused to sign. Her husband, Bradley, had moved to a hotel temporarily while they figured things out. The board had stripped her of her title. CEO became former CEO in every headline, every chyron, every search result that would follow her name forever. 3,000 employees waited to learn if they'd have jobs next month. And Quincy sat alone, surrounded by silk curtains and Italian marble, wondering when she'd stopped being able to tell the difference between strength and cruelty. Across the city, Jackson's life continued quietly. He declined every interview request, issued no statements, refused to participate in the narrative the media was constructing, the righteous victim, the humble hero, the symbol of everything Quincy wasn't. That wasn't the story he wanted to tell. Instead, he channeled his response into something structural. 3 weeks after the gala, the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund announced a new initiative, the Dignity in Leadership Program. A $50 million commitment to identify and invest in companies led by executives from underrepresented backgrounds, with one condition: every recipient would undergo annual culture audits, leadership evaluations, employee satisfaction reviews that couldn't be buried or dismissed. "Capital isn't neutral," Jackson said in the only public statement he made. "Where we invest reflects what we value. It's time we valued character as much as quarterly returns." The business press called it revolutionary. Critics called it performative. Jackson called it a beginning. He spent his mornings in meetings with community organizations, his afternoons reviewing applications from founders who'd been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed, his evenings at home with his wife and daughter, eating dinner at a table that had no chandeliers above it. He didn't watch the news about Quincy's trial. Didn't need to. Consequences had their own momentum now. The verdict came on a Tuesday in late January. Not a criminal conviction. The evidence wasn't sufficient for that. But a civil ruling that would follow Quincy Beneth for the rest of her career. The court finds that Beneth Global Solutions, under Ms. Beneth's leadership, engaged in a pattern of discriminatory practices that violated federal employment law. Damages are awarded to the plaintiffs in the amount of $14.7 million. Quincy wasn't in the courtroom. Her lawyers had advised against it. She watched from her apartment, alone, as the news ticker scrolled across the screen. Former CEO Quincy Beneth found liable in discrimination case. She turned off the television, sat in silence. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic humming, people walking, a world that had already begun to forget her name. But the record wouldn't forget, and neither would she. Somewhere in Detroit, Jackson stood in a community center gymnasium, watching young entrepreneurs pitch their ideas to a panel of investors he'd assembled. His phone buzzed with the verdict notification. He glanced at it, then put it away. There was work to do. 6 months later, spring had come to Detroit. Jackson stood on the rooftop terrace of the Whitmore Community Innovation Center, a converted warehouse on the east side that now housed 12 startup incubators, a workforce development program, and a childcare facility for parents who couldn't afford to choose between ambition and family. The ribbon cutting had been that morning. No chandeliers, no champagne tables, just folding chairs, homemade refreshments, and a crowd of people who'd built something real with their hands and their hope. His mother had cried. His daughter had asked if she could cut the ribbon herself. He'd let her. Now, as the afternoon sun stretched golden across the skyline, a reporter approached him with a notebook and a question she'd clearly been saving. "Mr. Jackson, do you have any regrets about what happened at the Whitmore Gala?" He considered the question. No. Not even about how public it became. Some have called it cancel culture. Have they? Jackson turned to face her fully. A woman made a choice, the world saw it, and consequences followed. That's not cancellation, that's accountability. But she lost everything. She lost her position, her reputation, her assumptions about who deserves respect. He paused. She didn't lose her life, her freedom, her chance to become someone different. That's more than many people get. The reporter scribbled notes. What would you say to her now, if she were standing here? Jackson looked out at the city, the cranes building new housing, the murals painted on old brick, the children playing in a park that had been a vacant lot 2 years ago. I wouldn't say anything, he said quietly. Some lessons don't need teachers. They need time. Quincy Beneth had found time. More than she'd ever wanted. The penthouse was gone, sold to cover legal fees and settlement payments. The board seat, the speaking invitations, the charity galas that had once defined her calendar, all of it had evaporated like morning fog. She lived now in a modest apartment in Connecticut, far from the city that had once been her kingdom. No staff, no entourage, no circle of admirers laughing at her jokes. Just silence. And, slowly, something that might have been clarity. She'd started seeing a therapist 3 months ago, not for public rehabilitation. There was no public left to rehabilitate for. But for herself, for the woman she'd buried beneath decades of armor and ambition. Why did you need him to be less than you? The question had broken something open. She didn't have an answer yet, but she was learning to sit with the question instead of running from it. Some mornings she woke up angry, at Jackson, at the world, at the unfairness of being judged for one moment when she'd spent 46 years building something real. Other mornings, she woke up and understood. The video hadn't created who she was, it had revealed it, and revelation, however painful, was the beginning of change. The think pieces had moved on, the hashtags had faded. The world had found new outrages, new villains, new cycles of fury and forgetting. But something had shifted, subtly, structurally, in ways that wouldn't make headlines, but might make history. Companies began auditing their complaint systems. Boards started asking harder questions about leadership culture. A generation of young professionals had watched a powerful woman face consequences and learned that immunity wasn't guaranteed. Not cancel culture, accountability culture. The difference was everything. On a warm evening in May, Jackson attended a small gathering at the Innovation Center. No press, no cameras, just 20 entrepreneurs who'd received funding through the Dignity in Leadership program, sharing dinner and stories in a room with exposed brick and second-hand furniture. A young woman named Maya, 26, first-generation college graduate, founder of a tech startup focused on accessible healthcare, approached him with a glass of lemonade. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night at the gala," she hesitated. "Why didn't you tell her who you were? You could have ended it immediately." Jackson accepted the lemonade, took a sip, thought about his grandfather's woodshop, the sawdust on calloused hands, the lessons that had shaped everything. "Because respect shouldn't depend on resumes," he said finally. "And if it takes a title to make someone treat you like a human being, then they were never really seeing you in the first place." Maya nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She walked back to her table, where other founders were laughing about something, their faces bright with possibility. Jackson watched them. Different room, different people, dignity intact. He smiled and let the silence speak for itself. Because power, when it's real, doesn't need to shout. It waits, and then it decides. The question isn't what Jackson did with his. The question is, what will you do with yours?